Fire is an incredibly powerful tool, for its discovery is believed to have been the catalyst that propelled humanity from their primitive hunter-gatherer days to eventually become the ones who built the complex civilizations we know today. To put it into perspective, fire gave our ancestors the ability to forge their own fate, both literally and metaphorically. No longer were they restricted by darkness, cold, and hunger. With fire, humanity gained the power to survive against nature rather than be at the mercy of its influence. Therefore, it shouldn't be surprising when I say that fire played a significant role in mankind's evolution, both societal and, to a lesser extent, biological. As a result of this, ancient nations from all across the world each developed their own myths, legends, and tales about the origins of the first flame and how it was passed down to humans, often through divine meddling or intervention. So, why am I telling you this? Well, the answer to that is quite simple. With the release of Natlan, the Nation of War, Genshin Impact introduced a new term known as the Primal Fire, which refers to an ancient divine flame that can sustain the land of Natlan and repel the influence of the Abyss. From its name, you know what? Hold on a sec. Pause. Here, let me tell you a secret. Come closer. You see, guys, don't tell anyone, but the Primal Fire isn't actually a new term at all. We have known about it for a long time. Ironically, a tiny bit longer than we have known about the Primordial Sea. On Monday, August 14, 2023, 2 days before the release of Fontaine in patch 4.0, Hoyoverse uploaded their customary character reveals for the subsequent version, in this case patch 4.1, which included none other than Monsieur Neuvillette, and his introduction was narrated by a character named Xbalanque, the one entombed with the Primal Fire. That was our very first official exposure to the concept of the Primal Fire, and shortly after that, when Fontaine came out, bringing with it the lore of the Primordial Sea, I made a couple of videos commenting on the nature of the Primal Fire and why it is a similar type of power to the Primordial Sea. But how could I have been so sure about all of that way back then when we barely knew anything about it? The most obvious answer is that both are described as being these primordial forces originating from the world's very inception. And while that's definitely a very solid indicator, there's actually another more substantial reason that led me to this conclusion. Let me explain. It goes without saying that Neuvillette, being the ancient dragon sovereign of water, is a character of paramount importance to Genshin's story. And in case you didn't know, he was the one to narrate the character introduction of the Dendro Archon Kusanali. Kusanali, or rather Boer, is of course the god of wisdom and the current holder of the authority of Verdure that originally belonged to the ancient dragon Apep. She is a character noteworthy enough for the sovereign of water himself to introduce her. Thus, continuing on that pattern, the one who narrates Neuvillette's introduction, Xbalanque, the one entombed with the Primal Fire, must likewise be a critical player in the story. After Neuvillette reclaimed the authority of water, he gained with it complete mastery over the Primordial Sea and the archy energies of Fontaine, allowing him to accomplish things with them that neither Egeria nor Focalors could dream of doing. Neuvillette tells the traveler that the Primordial Sea fostered life on Tevat in its early beginnings, and what's interesting in that context is that in ancient Greek, the word archy means beginning or origin. Furthermore, archy consists of two opposing energies, pneuma and ousia, which in turn translate to spirit/soul and essence/substance respectively. On many occasions across Genshin Impact, the Abyss is metaphorically equated with the ocean and the sea, and during his expedition into the Vrukasha Oasis, René de Petrichor comments on how abyssal energy possesses a will of its own, just like the Kvarena spirits that were created to purify and annihilate it. Now, the Pari are a type of Kvarena, and one thing you will immediately notice about them is that they resemble baby Oceanids. Makes sense knowing that Egeria played an integral role in the creation of both. We know that Oceanids can dissolve themselves in the Primordial Sea, where they become a sort of giant collective consciousness. This means that the Primordial Sea contains in it souls or wills, much like the Abyss, which is also a sea, metaphorically. However, the Primordial Sea nurtures life, while the Abyss corrupts and consumes it. The two are different. All of that allows us to logically deduce that the Primordial Sea must be the opposite counterpart of the Abyssal Sea. Makes sense when you think about it, but that statement isn't accurate. Not that I think it's wrong, rather it's partially correct. The issue here is that this entailment fails to take into account a number of other necessary factors, well, 6 or 7 of them. Because the Primordial Sea only involves the Hydro element, so it cannot possibly be the antithesis of the Abyss on its own. Instead, it is part of something bigger, and that is the true antithesis of the Abyss. What is it? A good question. This is where the Primal Fire comes in, because guess what can also repel the Abyss? The Primal Fire. That's why Mavuika and the people of Natlan are attempting to fan its flames and reignite it once more. Since a Dragon Sovereign can use the Hydro Authority to completely control the Primordial Sea, the Primal Fire would then also be directly under the dominion of the Pyro Sovereign's authority. As a matter of fact, if that is true, then the other elements will also have an equivalent primordial force. If you're wondering what that would look like for Apep's authority, it's probably Irminsul and the Leylines. In simpler terms, each dragon authority is responsible for controlling a corresponding primeval force, be it the Primal Fire, the Primordial Sea, or potentially even the Leylines. And these world-altering forces, controlled by the authorities of the 7 Dragon Sovereigns, must have been the quote-unquote elements that made up the Light Realm, hence why the human realm is said to have been made out of the fragments of the Light Realm. Nonetheless, do the spirit flames of the Primal Fire have a will of their own? They sure as hell might. After all, Mavuika seemingly talks to them at the end of the Natlan Ignition teaser, but alternatively, she might be talking to the one entombed in them, Xbalanque. And speaking of Xbalanque, is he the Pyro Sovereign? No, he's not. We know he's not. Any chances of that being the case fall flat on their face the moment you read Nouvelette's character introduction, where Xbalanque says, "Someday when they return, their true ordeal shall begin." The they in that sentence are clearly the Dragon Sovereigns, so it doesn't make sense for Xbalanque to call them they had he been one of them. The next best option was that Xbalanque could have been another dragon, or a servant of the ancient sovereigns, and that was the assumption I ran with for the longest time until I saw Mavuika, since thinking about her made me realize that that's not the case either. As it turns out, answering this question will require us to first delve into how the Primal Fire ended in the hands of mortals to begin with, and for that, we're gonna have to pay a visit to good old Greek mythology. Greek myths have a track record of being consistently precise in Genshin Impact. For a recent example that demonstrates what I mean, in this video about the Hexen Circle, I predicted that Dainsleif's brother, Vedderfolnir, was the sinner who talked to Clothar in the Archon quest Rebirth. The main reason I was able to make this prediction was thanks to a painting by the Italian artist Marco Liberi, which depicts the king of the Olympians, Zeus, chasing down the goddess of divinations, Asteria. Long story short, in that video I equated Zeus to the Nordic hawk Vedderfolnir and Asteria to Astromancer Barbeleth, then proceeded with the rest of the analysis from there. And here I am going to attempt to do this again with the Primal Fire. Genshin Impact draws heavily from Greek mythology, and when I say draws, I don't mean in the sense of simply being inspired by, rather, the game will sometimes go as far as to reenact certain myths directly in the story. Even the Primordial One and its 4 shades are based on Greek gods, with Phanes, a creator deity from the Orphic sect of Greek traditions, being the potential name of the Primordial One. With respect to that, the demon gods of Celestia, including the Archons, could fulfill the role of the Olympians. It's easy to see that when you take into account the fact that Celestia were not the original rulers of the world, and instead conquered it from the dragons. Also, there is this whole thing where Barbetos is literally Dionysus, one of the 12 Olympians. Like, seriously, Lil Bro has more in common with Dionysus than Dionysus does with himself. Anyway, following that logic, the ones who preceded the Olympians are going to be the Titans. In other words, the ancient dragons. And indeed, the ancient dragons were titanic creatures who lost their world to the gods. It has been apparent over time that the Dragon Sovereigns are deities of life and evolution. This becomes abundantly clear the moment you take into account the type of things that Apep and Nouvellette can do, along with their general design elements and motifs. From housing entire ecosystems to turning water into blood, it's hard for me to see how humans and dragons won't benefit from one another if they learn to get along. Funnily though, that's precisely what the plotline of Natlan revolves around. The Nation of War is all about the mutual coexistence of humanity with dragons. But that coexistence must have begun somewhere. There has to be a point of origin. Lucky for us, there happens to be a Greek myth that perfectly fits the context that we need. I am of course talking about the legend of Prometheus and the sacred fire. Following the war between the Titans and the gods, one of the Titans who sided with the Olympians, Prometheus, was tasked by the king of the gods Zeus with creating humanity, which he did by fashioning them out of clay. Zeus then decreed that humans were to remain ignorant and primitive, vulnerable to nature and dependent on the gods for protection. However, Prometheus was not satisfied with this, for he envisioned his creation with a greater purpose. Thus, he climbed Mount Olympus and stole a bundle of the sacred fire from the gods, then brought it down to the earth and gave it to humanity. Prometheus's gift became the catalyst for the rapid progression of civilization. With fire, humanity gained the power to tend to themselves, forge weapons, and ultimately dominate the natural order. When Zeus saw what had happened, he became enraged and enforced a brutal punishment on the Titan. Prometheus was chained on a rocky cliff where every morning a vulture would visit him to tear out his liver and devour it, only for it to regenerate overnight, with this continuing for all eternity. What's insane about all of this is that Prometheus had the power of foresight, allowing him to predict the future. Yet he still gave humanity fire, and despite his suffering, Prometheus never expressed regret for what he had done. I personally think that in Genshin, there must have been a Prometheus-like figure in the past, who stole the primal fire either from the gods or from the Pyro Sovereign, then passed it down to humanity. Now, since Prometheus was a Titan, then his Genshin counterpart should be an ancient dragon. Not necessarily a dragon sovereign, just a noteworthy ancient dragon. And while I can't say for sure what their motivations were, maybe they did it out of a sense of pity, or perhaps they were driven by the goal of evolution for both humanity and their kin. What we know for certain is that this act of sharing the primal fire changed the landscape of Natlan forever. Interestingly, many years after he gave the fire to humanity, the Greek hero Heracles challenged and slayed the vulture that tormented Prometheus, saving him in the process. And I believe that whoever this hero is unto that, Xbalanque is either him or one of his descendants. The artifact set, Unfinished Reverie, talks about an enigmatic Scarlet-Eyed Hero who saved and befriended the dragons of Natlan, the Saurians. This seemingly young man assembled a party of 5 heroes to help him kill an evil dragon in an ancient city, which they managed to do at the cost of all of their lives except for one, a young lady named Sakuk, who was the first to join the heroes' party. In her old age, Sakuk recalls how after defeating the evil tyrant that killed her compatriots, the Scarlet-Eyed Hero whom she had fallen in love with returned to the sacred fire, leaving her as the only survivor of the heroes' party. It's pretty damn obvious that this Scarlet-Eyed Hero, who returned to the sacred fire, is the same as the one entombed with the primal fire, Xbalanque. And it's also pretty damn obvious that he is, or at least was, the Pyro Archon. The character of Xbalanque is inspired by the legendary Mayan myth of the hero twins Hunahpu and Xbalanque. The twins were the sons of Blood Moon, a daughter of one of the lords of the underworld, which makes me think of the Crimson Moon, but that's honestly a whole other topic on its own. The story follows Hunahpu and Xbalanque as they journey to the underworld to challenge the gods of death. After long, arduous trials, the two twins emerge victorious, killing some of the gods of death in the process. They then climbed into the heavens where Hunahpu became the sun and Xbalanque the moon, which fits very well with the name of Natlan's chapter, Incandescent Ode of Resurrection. The word incandescent implies a brilliant, intense, or glowing quality often associated with heat or light. This heat can be very easily correlated with the primal fire. An ode is a poem that is often used to express praise or admiration towards a particular person for their accomplishments or great deeds. This person, who is the subject of the ode, is likely Xbalanque, and I say this because the ode is an ode of resurrection, something that Xbalanque was associated with in Mayan mythology. You see, I don't think that the battle against the evil tyrant described in Unfinished Reverie was Xbalanque's first rodeo. The artifact set describes the Scarlet-Eyed Hero as someone who encountered countless calamities throughout his lifetime. My current assessment is that Xbalanque, if he is indeed the counterpart of Heracles, used to be a good friend of Genshin's Prometheus, the dragon who gave humanity fire. He later became the Pyro Archon at some point before or during the Archon War, winning himself a seat amongst the Seven, and with it the Pyro Authority and the power to control the primal fire. It's really hard to say what happens beyond that point, but I'm gonna give it a shot anyway. Natlan's characters utilize a mechanic known as Night Soul for their abilities. When the Night Soul bar is depleted during exploration, characters gain access to a new bar called Phlogiston Meter, which allows them to extend the duration of their abilities. The term phlogiston is derived from a bullshit scientific theory put together in 1703 which proposed the existence of an invisible hypothetical substance called phlogiston in combustible materials. When a material burned, the phlogiston would be released, leaving behind a less pure substance called a calx. Now, the phlogiston theory is completely unpractical on Earth due to the existence of oxygen gas. But in the context of Genshin, where we are talking about a divine flame that can sustain the land and ward off the influence of the abyss, yeah, things start to get different. My guess is that in order to better protect Natlan, Xbalanque used himself as kindling for the primal fire in such a manner that whenever the nation found itself facing unsurmountable disasters or enemies, he could resurrect himself to save it. But on all other occasions, his power would be distributed across the entirety of the land of Natlan, granting its inhabitants additional strength and endurance, which by extension serves to reduce the probability that they would have to rely on him to save them. And that power of his is the phlogiston they burned. However, something really big likely happened during the Cataclysm of Kandria that denied Xbalanque the ability to resurrect himself anymore. And this is where Mavuika comes into play. I've already gone over most of the mythological stuff behind Mavuika in my Natlan speculation video, so I won't rehash them here. What you essentially need to know is that in Maori mythology, Mavuika was a goddess of earthly fire who happened to be the wife of Awahitoroa, the god of comets and heavenly fire. On the other hand, we know that Xbalanque exists in Genshin, but we so far have no mention of his twin brother Hunahpu, and that's quite a big deal because in the Mayan myth, Xbalanque ascended to become the moon, while Hunahpu became the sun. So, where is the sun? Funny enough, I see the sun when I look at Mavuika. It's legit in her eyes, there is nothing more to add here. So I wonder if Mavuika is supposed to be the one who fulfills the role of Hunahpu in Genshin. In Western alchemy, there is a concept related to the magnum opus known as the union of the Solar King and the Lunar Queen, which is done for the sake of producing Rubidu, the Philosopher's Stone. This alchemical concept is a reoccurring theme throughout Genshin. Some prominent examples of it include Amun and Nabu Malikata, Morax and Hagentis, and the literal main characters of the game, the Traveler and Paimon. Mavuika and Xbalanque are probably going to be another example of that. Except in their case, Xbalanque should be the Lunar King, while Mavuika is the Solar Queen, but that's honestly a non-issue, it's essentially the same thing. I suspect that Mavuika's relationship with Xbalanque is one of two things. She is either his sibling, Hunahpu, or she is Xbalanque's successor. And those two options can be further divided again. If she is supposed to be Hunahpu, then she could be Xbalanque's sister, since Hunahpu was his brother, or Xbalanque's consort if we are to go with Maori mythology. Alternatively, if she is his successor, then she might be his successor in the sense of being the one who ascended after him, or his successor as in his disciple, where Xbalanque would be a teacher/master figure to her. By the way, she could also be a combination of any of those four options, but then it gets unnecessarily complicated, so in the interest of time, I'm just gonna skip that. Regardless, one of the things that we can say with confidence is that Mavuika is definitely a god, or at the very least, some sort of divine spirit. I highly doubt that she is anything less than that, since she doesn't seem to wield a vision, in addition to the fact that she takes on Il Capitano, who is himself one of the most powerful characters on Tevat. Look, ignore the title itself, the idea is that she basically sits around the same ballpark as the gods. But despite her godlike power, Mavuika is actually unlikely to be the Pyro Archon, and the reason behind why that is the case could simultaneously explain the lack of a Pyro Traveler on Natlan's release. Although there can only be one Archon for each divine throne in Celestia, nothing stops a nation from being ruled by two gods. We've already seen this in Inazuma with Baal in Beelzebul. Here, I think that Mavuika and Xbalanque, at least for some short but significant period of time, ruled the nation of Natlan together. During that time, the two of them must have split the role of the Archon amongst themselves, where Xbalanque gave Mavuika the Pyronosis, while he kept the authority of fire that he got from ascending to the divine throne. We can make this assumption due to the fact that Il Capitano challenges Mavuika for the Pyronosis, which highly increases the likelihood of it actually being in her possession. After Xbalanque became incapacitated, Mavuika must have assumed the position of the acting Archon with its full responsibilities, as evidenced by the fact that the Natlanian statues of the Seven are made in her image. But these statues have nothing in them for the traveler to resonate with, because the authority of fire is still with Xbalanque. Remember, when the traveler taps into a statue of the Seven, they don't resonate with the power of the Archon themselves, but rather with the authority which that Archon holds. In other words, the power of the ancient dragon sovereigns. This became clear after the Hydra Sovereign came out in patch 4.1, since the traveler is a straight-up dogshit version of Nouvellette. And that is likely to be the lore explanation for why we are not going to be getting a Pyro Traveler for the foreseeable future. It's because even if the Traveler tries to resonate with Mavuika's statue, there is nothing in there for them to actually tap into, since the authority of fire is sealed away with Xbalanque, while the current god of the nation only has the Gnosis. The amount of assumptions I've made in this video is insane. Honestly, if even half of this theory turns out to be true, I'm gonna be happy. Anyway, there is still one loose thread left to explore, and it involves Mavuika's plan along with what the Traveler will be doing in Natlan. The tournament that Mavuika sets up is known as the Pilgrimage, which immediately implies some kind of journey. This pilgrimage is mentioned directly in the Pyro Gemstone, which reads, "A pilgrimage for a wish, a battle to earn a name, burnt to cinders for a dream, if the intention yet remains, achieved blank's truth he has." At this point, I am no longer sure whether this description is narrated by Mavuika or Xbalanque, but I am going to assume that it's Mavuika only because of the part that says burnt to cinders for a dream, since the person being burnt should be Xbalanque. Nonetheless, the narrator could be Xbalanque and he might just be talking about himself. It's impossible to know for sure. Anyway, we want to focus on the first line, a pilgrimage for a wish, a battle to earn a name. We know that Natlan has something known as ancient names, which if destroyed can affect a person's fate and destiny to some unspecified capacity. Now, the land of Natlan is divided into two parts. There is the nation itself, and then there is the Night Domain, which appears to have been corrupted by the Abyss. And in the Night Realm, we can see these roaming ghosts which heavily resemble humanities from the Dark Souls series. But these could just be quote-unquote normal ghosts, so I won't get into that here. We know that the spirit flames of Natlan's 6 tribes are directly linked to the primal fire itself, and one of the reasons behind Mavuika's pilgrimage is to collect contending fires from the battles of the warriors participating in the tournament. These battles are likely going to be used to fan the flames of the primordial fire. However, I wonder if this process has to be done from the Night Domain instead of Natlan's surface, hence why the hero's party travels there in the Archon quest. But Mavuika's goal isn't going to be as simple as fanning the primal fire. After all, the Abyss is creeping in, and Natlan has less than a year before total annihilation. So, Mavuika is likely buying time for the sake of accomplishing something far bigger and more complex. With her nation on the precipice of collapse from the ever-encroaching Abyss, who is there better to help fight it than the Scarlet-Eyed Hero, who always protected Natlan whenever it needed him the most? Mavuika's plan, the incandescent Ode of Resurrection, is to bring back the Pyro Archon Xbalanque. Alright, you know what this means. We found her, boys. Mavuika is best girl. And that basically brings us to the end of this video. But hold on, nah, stay right where you are. I still have one cool little thing to share with you. Some of you might have noticed that the hero's party assembled by Xbalanque in the description of the artifact set Unfinished Reverie is almost identical to the heroes of Simulanka, with both consisting of 6 members who go on a quest to defeat an evil dragon. The hero of Simulanka, and therefore the counterpart of Xbalanque, is Scaramouche. I find this really funny since in Boer's fairy tale, Meow decides to become the moon, while Xbalanque became the moon in Mayan mythology. This honestly makes me wonder if Xbalanque will have some cat elements in his design. Wait! He actually might, because Xbalanque is heavily associated with jaguars. Also, his name itself means Jaguar Son! Oh shit, this outro is so cooked! Had I noticed this before, I would have put it way earlier in the video! Oh! We first had Meow, and now we might unironically get Meowbalanque. At any rate, as always, huge thanks to everyone who supports this channel on Patreon, and thank you for watching till here. And bro, damn, I sure hope you watched till the end after that Meowbalanque epiphany I just had. For now, I've been My Name for Now, and I will catch you in the next one. Take care.